Sometimes good news is bad news. The good news about our unemployment figures and how many new jobs have been created is, I guess, in some ways bad news for those hoping for interest rates to drop. So what does the latest data mean for interest rates? And by the way, how does the Reserve Bank even decide what to do with rates? What are the many factors involved in their decision-making process? That's what we discuss today in my chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Now, if you're a regular listener, you probably know I also record a weekly video with Andrew Wilson that we call Property Insiders. And today's podcast is the audio of one of the recent Property Insiders videos, but you don't need to see the video. There's not many charts today. So let's hear from Andrew Wilson what's ahead for interest rates and why he's concerned that the Reserve Bank may not drop interest rates anytime soon.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
There was great news on the job front recently. Australia's unemployment rate plunged to a new low of 3.7% in February. But this has raised the question of how well did those 13 interest rate rises work to slow down the economy and kill inflation? This unexpectedly strong jobs market data has cast doubt on the possibility of an imminent rate cut. Many borrowers were hoping for some relief in interest rates sooner rather than later. Prior to the February figures, there were talk of rate cuts by the middle of this year, but many economists were predicting cooling labour markets in response to the Reserve Bank's recent series of interest rate hikes, and they thought rates would start to come down. Remember, if unemployment rises, the Reserve Bank may worry about a slowing economy or even the possibility of a recession, and they may have started to cut rates. However, the February figures paint a very different picture. Not only did unemployment fall, but a significant number of new jobs were created. And this robust jobs market data has got many economists scrambling to revise their interest rate predictions. Interestingly, not Dr. Andrew Wilson, who I'm going to chat with about this in a moment, because he was a little bit more cautious about what's ahead. Now, many analysts believe the banks are going to hold or even increase interest rates because low unemployment could contribute to inflationary pressures as businesses compete for tighter pool of labour and potentially leading to higher wages. Of course, this is exactly the scenario the Reserve Bank was trying to avoid. So what does this mean for our economy and for the future of interest rates? That's one of the questions I'm going to ask Dr. Andrew Wilson, Australia's leading housing economist and chief economist of My Housing Market, in this week's Property Insider Chat. Hi, Andrew.
Yes, good day, Michael. And finally, some validation of what we've been saying really for months. And that's really this head-shaking nonsense that's been coming out of a number of sources in relation to interest rate cuts in Australia, which couldn't be further away, really. And the data as it's coming through is pointing to that outcome increasingly. And maybe some of these analysts and economists, financial journalists who have been predicting this should be looking for employment in other fields where they could be a bit more successful. But certainly the latest data continues to show that the impact of interest rates on the Australian economy has been negligible. Of course, we went through that big pause getting on to a year ago, which was highly questionable. The Reserve Bank was forced to backtrack and raise rates later in the year because inflation had started to rise again. It begs the question, really, have rates done anything? Well, the answer to that is really no, particularly given strong labour market data that we had. But we need to take that with a grain of salt, Michael. That data has been up and down. The ABS does concede that its seasonal adjustment modelling has been put out of whack by COVID. It'll take some time to get that normalised to some degree, but it was unequivocally strong data for the labour market. Again, we're in a boom economy, near record low unemployment rate, surging employment and sharply falling unemployment. This comes off 12, 13 interest rate increases since May 2022. So it's really done nothing. And then we look at inflation. Yes, that's fallen sharply, but really that's tracking the price of oil. And we'll look at the price of oil, how that's moved today. But unfortunately, that's on the rise again. That's certainly not good news for the outlook for inflation. And once again, is bringing into question that, as we've discussed, the certainly still likelihood of having higher interest rates in the future.
Well, we know that in March, the Reserve Bank left interest rates on hold. This was the third consecutive steady decision by the Reserve Bank. But what does all this mean now with the jobs data, the retail figures, and all the other bits?
Well, yes, the Reserve Bank predictably left rates on hold over March. Of course, the meeting was a little later this month, this March. Usually days gone by, we had the Reserve Bank meeting the first Tuesday every month. It's now only 8 meetings. That was 11 meetings per year because they didn't meet in January. But now we have 8 meetings in the revised Reserve Bank agenda, and this was a little later now. We won't have a meeting over April. So that was the third consecutive steady decision by the RBA. We've had, as I mentioned, 13 rate rises since May 22. Economy is still strong. We've seen that latest labour market data, which is very strong, and retail sales are still high. Inflation is lower, but it's still too high and ahead of the target range for the Reserve Bank. And the concern is that higher fuel prices will reignite inflation in the shorter term. Fingers crossed that doesn't happen, but signs aren't good. I thought it was interesting, Michael, when we look at the commentary from the Reserve Bank's decision last week, it was very neutral. When we discussed the previous decision, the February decision, the Reserve Bank actually was quite hawkish. They were saying quite clearly that, look, don't rule out another interest rate increase. And that was picked up by a lot of international media, saying that the Australian Reserve Bank, because at that stage, the US particularly was still going gung-ho on interest rate cuts potentially. And they were saying, well, look, this has gone against what everybody else is saying. Other central banks are saying that the Australian Reserve Bank had said, well, look, we still can't rule out higher interest rates. But I thought this month its commentary was very neutral, Michael. It said clearly, and I think the key statement was that the board was not ruling anything in or out. So it was just taking a very even-hand approach without saying one thing or the other in terms of whether the outlook was for higher or lower interest rates. And I think that was a little bit of a cop-out from the Reserve Bank in terms of the outlook. And I think it's sort of moving into a much more insipid, neutral type of stance in terms of its view of the economy and the outlook for interest rates. And I think that it's got to comment on changes to the data as it is coming through in the shorter term, rather than saying, well, look, we're waiting for things to sort of evolve. So I'm not sure where the economic insights are being generated at the Reserve Bank, but certainly there was nothing to grab from what the Reserve Bank said in its commentary in relation to its decision last week. We'll wait for the minutes to see some further insights from that. But I did think it was a big change from the commentary that they provided in February, which was more direct in terms of its opinion of the economy. So interest rates have and the direction of interest rates. And the interest rates are certainly now flattening out. No surprise. I think we've got to understand, Michael, also that Australian interest rates, official rates, are still the best part of 1% below the US. So any chat of cut to rates here, independent of the US, even with the US cutting rates, would expose our currency because we'd be falling backwards against the US dollar, given that our interest rates are significantly lower already than the US. But as I said, this is just clickbait, these projections of interest rate cuts. And it's the roller coaster flip-flop of commentary on economy, which is frustrating, head shaking. But again, it's up to the public to sort of make their decisions on where they get their information. And let's hope they're not making decisions on this bounce around in interest rates. But what we've done today, Michael, which is a little interesting, is looking at those variables, if you'd like.
Let's make it clear. The Reserve Bank's job is to keep inflation within a band of 2 to 3% and keep our economy chugging along nicely, but not too quickly or not too slowly and fall into recession. So we talked about inflation and we talked about employment, but the Reserve Bank probably has a look at a whole lot of variables, doesn't it, Andrew? What are the many factors they take into account when they make their decisions?
Well, if we take an analytical approach to the outlooks for interest rates, Michael, I think it can be revealing and look at those variables, as you mentioned. And if we go through them all and perhaps give them an upward arrow or a downward arrow or a steady arrow in terms of what it means for the outlook for interest rates, certainly inflation is the big picture. That's our view. We've had inflation rising at the highest levels for decades as a result of that mismatch between supply and demand from the COVID period. Inflation has fallen sharply. The latest data on inflation has shown that the recent sharp falls have now eased. In fact, headline inflation was steady over January, showing that the track of inflation, the decline in inflation, is starting to ease. We expect that because the last little bit is going to be the hardest. And the key drivers of inflation are still there, and that's particularly oil prices. And we've done this analysis before, Michael, where we show how oil price declines have tracked inflation declines. This is the case everywhere, really, that falling inflation really has been a product of falling oil prices. But the bad news, and we'll look at the charts shortly, is that oil prices are on the rise again. So that is certainly a negative for any thought of a cut in interest rates and positive for higher interest rates. House building costs are another key factor in the inflation rate. House costs have been a consistent driver of higher inflation. And a key part of house costs are those house building costs. And they've bounced back over January and on the rise again. So that's another sort of upward arrow for interest rate prospects, Michael. Home rents, of course, as we keep revealing here, are still on the rise. Bad news for tenants. That's another upward arrow for the potential of interest rate changes. And the jobless rate is falling, and we'll look at the numbers shortly, Michael. Very strong numbers over February for the jobless numbers. So that, again, is upward pressure on interest rates, although the Reserve Bank would be happy to have a strong economy as long as it didn't push wages up, which then pushed up prices. So retail sales are rising, but the trend has certainly flattened out. They're still high. I'd say that's a neutral impact on rates. House price growth is continuing. The Reserve Bank, in my opinion, pays too much attention to housing market outcomes. But it certainly would be trepidatious from its point of view as house prices increase in terms of it being a consideration for falling interest rates, which may only push up house prices even more. So I'd say that would be a neutral at the moment for interest rates. We mentioned the US rates are still well ahead of Australia. So I think that's a neutral, because I think we'd have to wait to see US rates cut before we even considered cutting our rates, considering we're well below that. And that focus in the US and Europe has certainly changed from interest rate cuts, which were almost hysterical predictions of that the end of last year and the beginning of this year, Michael. And economic growth is slowing in Australia. Still positive, no sign of a recession, but it is slowing, and that's a downward arrow for the prospect of interest rates. So we put all those arrows together, Michael, for those key factors. I still think that we're looking at an outcome on hold, but I do think the bias is now shifting to an interest rate rise, given the latest data, Michael.
Well, that's going to disappoint some people who are expecting a lower interest rate and lower mortgage costs for a while. Clearly, there are people hurting in the economy. So while we're saying the economy is strong and job growth is strong, the cost of living has affected a portion of the population. But we've got to remember that a third of Australia's population rent, and so they're not affected as much by interest rates, even though they're affected by rising rents. Half of the homeowners don't even have a mortgage. And so in some ways creating two tiers, isn't it, Andrew? Those who own property, they're doing really well at the moment. Their properties are going up in value, rents are going up, and some people don't even have a mortgage against those. So it's going to be good news and bad news for people, these sort of results. Now, we spoke a little bit about oil. You mentioned that a moment ago. Let's make it clear. You can see quite a clear correlation between the price of oil and inflation.
Well, there is a correlation, Michael. We just have to track the cycles for both. We know interest rates, surprisingly, were increased after a period of flat results last year by the RBA through the middle of the year, and then they backtracked and increased rates. Well, that was on the back of a higher oil price. Just have to look at the Bowser at the moment, Michael. Prices are $2.20, $2.30 in Melbourne here, and that's back to the old days. And will the government step in? And again, if we do get oil prices higher and provide some assistance, this is really a vexed question for governments. I think that OPEC, who are the oil exporters, have decided that they want to get back to the good old days of over $100 US per barrel. We've seen oil break through the $80 US barrier. Where we'll really have alarm bells ringing is where the resistance level of $90 US a barrel is breached, if that occurs, because then that will really create upward momentum, and that will have significant impact on inflation, and it will certainly kill any suggestion of lower interest rates, because in fact it'll start to bring the higher interest rate call into focus. But I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm saying that the trend is clearly now upward for oil prices. OPEC have said that they're going to consider reducing production so that they can push prices up higher. So not good news there going forward. So we've just got to hope that current upward trend breaks even and starts to move downwards in terms of the outlook for interest rates.
Well, I'm sure you'll be keeping us updated on that in our weekly Property Insider chats. Now, one of the other factors that's in the news a lot is overseas migration booming. And while that's not directly taken into account by the Reserve Bank in its decision-making, clearly it does have an indirect impact in many of those things you were talking about, particularly our housing markets?
Yes, latest data from the ABS just confirming very strong bounce back from the lockdown period, Michael. It's a vexed question because obviously this bounce back in migration is creating high demand for housing. We're already undersupplied, reflects a large degree of the mismanagement of our housing markets policies over the past decade. We're stuck with it, unfortunately, and there's talk now from the government of starting to ease, particularly temporary migrants, to take some of the heat out of those undersupplied rental markets particularly. But the latest data, some interesting points. And it is backdated data. This is the data we'll discuss today, is the year to September last year. So that's going back a bit, Michael, but nonetheless, the trends are still pretty strong. When we look at overseas migration, New South Wales is still the leader there, Michael. I think we're getting a lot of expats still heading back into New South Wales, into Sydney, and that's part of what's driven that Sydney housing market. Again, this is backward-looking data. Typically, we see Victoria as the leader in overseas migration. It's still performing strongly, but behind New South Wales at the moment. I would expect over time that Victorian data to once again be the top state performer, and that, of course, will have some positive impacts on the Melbourne housing market. We're seeing early signs of that with rents on the rise in Melbourne from a lower base compared to the other capital cities. I thought the other interesting data, which again, when we're looking at the annual trends, is no surprise, but we can look at just how strong net migration has been into Queensland, and it's really surging, and clearly at double the levels that we saw prior to COVID. Now we're seeing the growth in migration, net migration into Queensland, and of course that's putting a lot of pressure on the southeast Queensland housing market, which still remains relatively affordable compared to Melbourne and Sydney. But certainly those prices, as we know and have discussed, are clearly on the rise in southeast Queensland. And no surprise given that constant surge in migration.
Well, our population's now reached 27 million people. The latest data, as you said, recently released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, was for the September quarter. But if you go back, the intergenerational report in 2007 projected Australia's population wouldn't reach this figure of around 26, 27 million people for another 10 years to 2034, 35. And underestimating the population growth seems to be a systemic policy failure that compounds the challenge for delivering sufficient housing. How can the government project its work out what infrastructure is needed, what housing is required, if it can't get our population figures right, Andrew?
Well, that's right, Michael, but that's looking back, and we miss the mark in a lot of these projections and forecasts, don't we? And it's a question about the competence of high-level analytics, but that's another point. And I think we've had plenty of signs over the past decade that we needed to build more property regardless of population projections, and we've continued to flounder around the same old view of the property market and supply from our policymakers, and they're paying the price now with this terrible undersupply that we're stuck in.
Well, one of the other factors is that there don't seem to be enough workers. There's not enough workers to help build that 1.2 million homes that we're planning, or the government's planning, over the next 5 years. And those construction workers are also taken up by the big infrastructure projects. So I know the Master Builders Association and the HIA is calling for more targeted immigration, people with the right sort of skills.
Well, yeah, look, that's cliche response, isn't it, from that source, and that's fair enough. But more migrants mean more demand for housing.
It's always fun chatting with Andrew Wilson. He's got some great insights, hasn't he? Now, if you're not currently a subscriber or follower to this podcast, please stop for a sec before we go on, and whatever podcast app you're on, just follow this podcast so twice a week you get the insights from my regular guests and from me. Oh, by the way, it'd be great if you left a review as well. Now, I hope you learned from Andrew Wilson that our property markets are at an interesting stage of the cycle where the markets are still very strong despite interest rate rises, and yes, interest rates may not fall for some time yet. But in the medium term, our property markets are going to be underpinned by three major factors: a significant growing population, still strong jobs growth, and the increasing wealth of our nation. And I see the current market offering a window of opportunity for property investors with a long-term focus. You see, we're still at the early stages of a new property cycle. Melbourne and Sydney are just reaching their previous peaks. Sure, some other states are beyond those peaks, but this is something we don't see very often. Now, I'm not trying to suggest you try and time the market. That's too difficult. And in truth, You missed the bottom of the market, but if you've been following this podcast, you would have known we picked that well over a year ago. But if the market hands you an opportunity like this to take advantage of the early stages of a new cycle, why not take advantage of it? In fact, that's created significant wealth for other investors in the past. Moving forward, demand is going to continue to outstrip supply for some time to come as we continue to experience record levels of immigration at a time when we're just not building anywhere near enough properties. And as you've heard us say in these podcasts before, construction costs for delivering new dwellings are only just going to keep rising, not only because of supply chain issues and costs of building going up, but the lack of sufficient skilled trades. And that means that it'll take some time for new projects to come out of the ground, and that'll only happen when they're financially viable, and that's only going to happen when market prices are considerably higher than the current market price. This is just a stage of the cycle I've been through many times, and as sure as night follows day, new construction will occur at a higher cost, and that'll pull up the price of established properties as well. Because in due course, consumer sentiment is going to rebound when it becomes clear that inflation is continuing to fall and interest rates are starting to fall as well. And at that time, pent-up demand is going to be released as greed, FOMO, overtakes fear, as it always does as the property cycle moves on. So if you want to make sure that you get ahead of the pack, if you want an unfair advantage, have a chat with my team at Metropole. We're much more than buyer's agents. We help our clients create intergenerational wealth safely by giving strategic property and wealth advice. We've got no properties for sale, but we're Australia's leading buyer's agent, and we'd love to help you plan to become the people you plan to become by helping you build a strategic property plan and then helping you implement it. Go to metropole.com.au and find out how we can help you.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
I'd like to have a chat about one thing most property investors, and probably you, are going to need to change to become a more successful property investor. I found that for most property investors to change their level of wealth, they personally must change. Now, rather than disagree, please humour me for a moment and listen on, because this has come from many, many years of working with both successful and not so successful investors. You see, sometimes we love change and sometimes we hate it. In fact, some of us love to change and others fear it. So why is change so difficult for many of us? And that's because change makes us move out of our comfort zones. It takes courage to leave something they're familiar with and to try something new. One of the jobs of our subconscious mind is survival, to protect us. So it likes to keep us in the same preferred safety and security locations and ways of doing things and ways of thinking over the untested and the unproven. Haven't we all heard people say, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know? So we tend to believe that if we stick with what we know, with what's familiar, then we won't get hurt. But the problem is in terms of wealth creation, it's not what you know that's holding you back. It's not what most investors know or don't know that's holding them back. It's what they think they know that isn't so that's holding them back. Now, I know you're used to listening to my thoughts on property and property investment and money and success in this podcast. For a moment, though, I'd like to share with you something different, my thoughts on wealth creation, which is, it's really why you're in property in the first place anyway, isn't it? In fact, I'd like to discuss why so many Australians are not as far advanced with their wealth creation as they'd like to be. They're not as successful as they'd like to be, haven't developed the financial freedom they deserve, yet they continue to do the same thing over and over again, hoping somehow things will be different. Think about it. If you keep doing the things you've always done, you're going to keep getting the results you've always got. Now, I'm not belittling the success that you may already have in property, but I remember not that long ago, I was in a room of 100 successful business people, entrepreneurs and investors at Wealth Retreat. And one of the questions I asked them right at the beginning is, why aren't you wealthier than you are now? Why aren't you richer than you are now? and it had many of them stumped. And when we worked through why, it was because all successful people still have limiting beliefs. They still have their own wealth operating system, their mindset set at a particular level, and they can go further. And interestingly, conducting a number of exercises and doing special things, at the end of Wealth Retreat, they came out with a much turned up thermostat, financial thermostat. Their wealth operating system was much bigger, and they've got some huge goals. Now, I can't go through all that with you here now, but I'm just pointing out that this is a challenge that everybody has got. And there was only one person in that room who came to me and said, Michael, I don't have any limiting beliefs. Of course, that's not true. That was one of his limiting beliefs. But as I said, if you think you're going to move on without changing, it's not going to happen. So if what you've been looking for was where you've been looking, chances are you already have it. Doing more of the same even harder and longer isn't usually the answer. Being willing to change will usually create better results. So the thing is, you can have more because you can become more. So what holds most of us back? Well, as I explained a minute ago, it's what I call your wealth operating system, your financial blueprint, the programming we receive as a child. Now, as initially described by Wallace Wattles in his book Science of Getting Rich, I think it was a century ago, and more recently by T. Harv Ekers in his great book Secrets of the Millionaire Mind, which is a must-read for all property investors, they both said something alike: your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions, and your actions determine your results. So it's no coincidence that your inner world creates your outer world. The programming you received, usually as a child, that leads to your thoughts, to your fears, to your limitations about wealth creation today. So one of the first steps in change is changing your thoughts. So how do you think about money, about success, about prosperity? What do you say to yourself? What's that little voice in your head saying? For many of us, our thoughts revolve around fear or scarcity or limitation. The problem is what you focus on expands. If you think about fear, scarcity and limitation, what do you achieve? Remember what I said a moment ago. Your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions, and your actions lead to your results. So therefore, money is a result. Wealth is a result. Your health is a result. Your results in all fields have been caused by you, by your action. They occur in your outer world, but are determined by your thoughts and feelings, your inner world. So for many Australians, their current mindset just won't let them get to the next level. It's not what they know that prevents them from succeeding, as I said a moment ago. It's what they think is so that isn't correct that's their greatest obstacle. It's the way that they think that's their greatest barrier. It's because their programming, as I said, their wealth operating system, the way they were programmed by things they heard, the things they saw, the things they experienced when they were a child. This is the type of thermostat that was set usually when you're a child and gives each of us our feelings about money and wealth. The problem is, for most Australians, their thermostat isn't set for wealth. And it hasn't been changed. Those thoughts and feelings that you saw as a child were made with childhood consciousness and experience, and it's not relevant today. Many of us need to intentionally change our inner world, our way of thinking. We need to start thinking about prosperity, about abundance, and about success to enable us to attract those very things. First of all, we need to change the way we think about ourselves. We need to see ourselves as a wealthy person, as a wealth attractor, as a wealth creator. This means you need to change some of those ingrained thinking patterns that are probably going on in your head. To overcome some of the negative ways of thinking that have developed from the result of past experiences, that's what you're going to have to do as well. But as I said a while ago, we're scared. Why are we scared of change? Why do we find it hard to change our way of thinking when change is natural? In fact, the only constant in the world, the only thing that absolutely count on is change itself. Well, I guess, and also death, isn't it? But it's often because our subconscious mind, as I said, is programmed to protect us, to stop us changing. Yet most successful people all share one critical characteristic, the trait of adaptability. They embrace change. They look for opportunities to expand and learn. Another common characteristic of successful property investors, of successful people in all ilks, is that they've got a mentor. and they belong to a mastermind group, and they hang out with like-minded, successful people. Because if you continue to do things that you've always done, you're going to continue to get the results you've always achieved. If you want to move forward in your wealth creation, you're going to have to change. I believe it was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different results. So results change when people change their way of thinking. Now, if anything I've said to you today has made an impression, you'll realise that if you're going to get to another place financially, then you're going to have to do some things differently. And doing things differently requires different thinking, first of all. If you change your thinking, you'll change your actions. If you change your actions, you'll change your results. I'm going around in circles, aren't I? But there's a reason for that, because the investors I've seen stuck in the same financial position just didn't understand the importance of what I've shared with you today. However, as I've already explained, you can have more. You can, because you can become more. You see, here's the other way the coin flips. Unless you change how you are, you'll always have what you've got. All that property stuff I share with you each week in the podcast, it's powerful, but on its own it won't do it. In order to have more, you need to become more. The rich keep getting richer because they're programmed, they're conditioned to, while most people are boxed in by the boundaries of their thoughts. So as I've said, wealth's a result. It's a result of your thoughts and your beliefs, which lead to your actions. It's important for you to understand that. It's important to understand that we're all fully responsible for our financial results. If things aren't working out the way you want to at the moment, you need to stop taking the easy way, and you need to stop blaming outside factors. It's not your boss's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's not the fact that interest rates are moving up. It's not the lack of information. You need to stop justifying why you're not financially successful. Most of what you've got today, you're attracted by becoming the person that you already are today. If you want to change your life financially, I keep saying it, you must change first. Everything you're doing right now, you're in the habit of doing, and everything you're not doing right now, you're also in the habit of not doing. You've heard me speak on the psychology of success before. You know, I suggest that you always get what your subconscious mind wants, not what you think you want. So if you want more wealth, sure, keep listening to this podcast. Listen to the Mindset Moments. Get mentors. Get a mastermind group. Maybe you should join my mentorship program. I've been running that for about 17 years now. I haven't actually promoted it a lot because it takes up time, and I spend a lot of one-on-one time with the people in my mentorship program. I haven't raised the cost of it, I think, for 15 years. But you could go to michaelyardney.com.au and find out about the mentorship program. I'll leave you a link in the show notes. Or get my team at Metropole to help you and hold you accountable. So one of the things we do when you become a client of Metropole, sure, we help you develop financial freedom, but we fix problems because some people have bought the wrong properties or just done the wrong things because they're bought emotionally. We help prevent problems, and we also help get you better results by foreseeing problems and challenges, by challenging the way you're thinking, not just about property, but about money. No, we're not psychology coaches, but my team understand what makes successful investors more successful. And an element of it is the money and the research and the properties, but it's also the way of thinking. And having somebody who thinks the way successful investors do, because our property strategists are already very successful in their own rights, will help bring you around to thinking in the way successful investors do. So while I normally say, have a chat with my team and help them build a strategic property plan, go to metropole.com.au and find out how we can help you, that's all part of it. But having a good team of people around you will help you think differently about yourself and about money. And maybe some of the lessons I've just shown you, talked to you about today, will help you get to the place you want to go. So work on yourself harder than you work on your job. Have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. And I look forward to being part of your wealth creation journey and helping you change, helping you move out of your comfort zone. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?